I'm really honored to be here, and is this in the right place? And to be part of this event with so many wonderful colleagues, and I wanted to thank Rosie Braidotti for letting me be part of this, and to thank everyone who's put so much work into making it happen, and thank you all for coming. And I was thinking before, I shouldn't take any time because this is too long, but when I was sitting there earlier this morning, I thought, you know what Edward allowed us to do was, I think, am I the only Palestinian in the panel, that he allowed a Palestinian to talk about something else besides Palestine, and he allowed people who weren't Palestinian to talk about Palestine. And I think that is the bridging that we have here today. So I'm pleased to be part of that. So I'm not going to talk about Palestine. What I'm going to talk about is from a book that I've just finished. So I begin with the observation that we seem to be living in remarkable times. A decade or so after women's rights served as one justification, or as Gayatri Spivak put it, one alibi for military intervention in Afghanistan, not only is the language of human rights on almost every tongue, but the call for global women's rights has gone mainstream. And the abuses that women suffer are no longer considered private matters or dismissed as insignificant in the international public sphere. And I think the feminists who work so hard to make this happen are probably surprised at how mainstream it is. And the signs of the seismic shift are everywhere, no more apparent than in some well-received books by writers in the United States, at least, who publish for a broad, educated public. Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Woodoon, whose book, Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunity for Women Worldwide, for example, is billed as, and here's a quote on the back cover, a call to arms against the most shocking and widespread human rights violation of our age, gender inequality. And I want to ask, what developments in global institutions, culture, industries, and politics have enabled the Western public to find so convincing and plausible the sanctimonious championing of women, distant women, by this New York Times columnist and his wife, or the fiery denunciations of Islamic patriarchy by the Somali emigre Ayaan Hirsi Ali that you exported to us, or even a liberal Princetonian philosopher's call to civilize Pakistani men who are waging a war on women. And I think these questions could not have been asked if Edward Said had not taught us how, by exposing so brilliantly the connections between power and knowledge in Orientalism. So in honor of his memory, I want to share with you today some of what he enabled for me to see about this new moment of the apparent triumph of global feminism. And the book that I've just finished is called Do Muslim Women Need Saving? And I ask sort of how the architects of this new common sense about going to war for women, how do they gain such authority? Why have so many people come to agree with their arguments, which manufacture consent for international military and humanitarian engagements across the Muslim world, when there are flaws in their reasoning, silences in their stories, partiality in their representations of women's problems, and when a myth of a place called Islamdom, inhabited by a creature called the Muslim woman, can be seen to lie at their core. And so in my book, which unlike Nicholas Kristof's, will never be made into a TV movie because it flies in the face of the new common sense, I argue that such public intellectuals, if we can dignify them with that, make their premises unassailable by drawing on a language of human and women's rights that has now tremendous currency. And this language insists that people around the world must learn how to be just and to measure up to a universal metric of humanity that's defined in part by aspirations for gender equality and women's freedom. But if the authority for this moral crusade to rescue women in other parts of the world depends on associating itself with this lofty language of universal rights that is itself embedded in a range of international institutions, I think its emotional persuasiveness derives from a bedrock on which such advocates can build. And this is a massively popular genre of writings about the wrongs other women suffer, particularly Muslim women. The genre is graphic, even pornographic. And I want to argue, in other words, that the discourse of international human rights that grounds this common sense depends on a more sordid discourse. Coming from the world of mass market commercial publishing and surely disdained by these writers, respectable writers, I think it nevertheless underwrites their crusade. And you've all seen them. In airport bookstores, an image of a veiled woman is paired with titles like Sold, One Woman's True Account of Modern Slavery, Without Mercy, Burned Alive, Married by Force, Daughters of Shame, on and on. So the two languages, one abstract and disinterested, the other affective, bleed into each other. And I think key to the vocabularies of both are consent, choice, and freedom. And the central drama is constructed as the difference between those who choose and those who do not, between those who are free and those who live in bondage. And although in my book I actually consider both of these languages and much more, in this lecture I just want to look at the second, what I call literary trafficking. And I'll talk about the political context in which these books are produced and reflect on how they might be affecting those who consume them. I'll also read against the grain of their dark titillations and strange alchemy, in which the exceptional becomes general, to let you glimpse, even in such formulaic stories, another way of thinking about the victim heroines who are the objects of such apparent, intense concern. So, we live, you know what's wrong here is that this microphone is too high for reading here. That's why Amr was doing that. Okay, so we live in an era in which the idea of universal human rights has been broadly accepted, and the very success of the institutionalization of the concept in myriad organizations and its virtual monopoly on the high ground of global morality led feminists beginning in the 1980s to try to link the struggle for women's rights and well-being to human rights. And I think activists in the international arena waged a successful campaign to declare women's rights as human rights. And they did this through drafting conventions, installing themselves in vast bureaucratic institutions, and putting in place mechanisms of accountability. If the evils of gender discrimination now seem so obvious, and the language of women's rights has such authority, we have to thank these conventions and these campaigns, which Janet Halley, a legal scholar at Harvard, has called part of governance feminism. But if the new common sense about the urgency of battling for women's rights gains authority through its association with this international consensus on the utopian high moral ground of universal rights, with its central value of choosing freely, it draws surreptitiously on a different discourse for its emotional appeal. A lurid genre of writing on abused women and girls, mostly Muslim, exploded onto the scene in the 1990s and took off after 9/11. And these books are read in book clubs, reviewed widely, and marketed aggressively. And the recurrent and defining themes of the genre are force and bondage. At one end are gentle memoirs like Azhar Nafisi's Reading Lalita and Tehran, and polemics like Ayaan Hirsi Ali's The Caged Virgin. At the other end are books that the literary scholar Dora Ahmed has called pulp nonfiction. And here we're plunged into dystopic worlds of violent abuse, our guides, the Muslim girls who have suffered and escaped. And as we all know, especially here, there's a long tradition of representing Muslim women in the West. Scholars call it gendered Orientalism, following the lead of Edward Said. Pictorial as well as literary, what's constant is that Muslim women are portrayed as culturally distinct, the mirror opposites of Western women. In the 19th century, the depictions took two forms. Women of the Orient were either portrayed as downtrodden victims who were imprisoned, secluded, shrouded, and treated as beasts of burden, or they appeared in a sensual world of excessive sexuality. And Christian missionary women appealed for support by decrying the oppression of their Muslim sisters in the first register. Artists and writers, and even the colonial postcard photographers of the earlier 20th century preferred the sensual and sexual. Now, the late 20th and early 21st century mass market paperbacks echo these themes, but have their own distinct style and character. Their protagonists are, as Dora Ahmed notes, plucky individualists with feminist ideals who do not want to remain trapped in their strange and sordid worlds. They want freedom, like the native informant celebrities whose denunciations of Islam as causing the oppression of women have been so warmly welcomed and whose careers have been bolstered by powerful institutions of the right. Celebrities whose personal stories are, as Saba Mahmoud has written, always told in terms of emancipation. So, should we treat these memoirs as nonfiction? That's how they're billed. Some are unreliable because they're based on repressed memories. Many of the protagonists are only known by their first names, so we don't know who they really are. Some books are based on secret knowledge, and some, like Nora Mahouri's Honor Lost, have been exposed as total hoaxes. Almost all the books are co-written with journalists or professional ghostwriters. They are therefore, at the least, mediated in complex ways. And to the extent that they may reflect real experiences or incidents, they're as disturbing as any incidents of abuse that we read about in our newspapers, our legal cases, or psychology case studies of pathological behavior. But the books work very hard not to let us make those comparisons. Although they're told in the first person of individual women, the traumas and abuses they catalog do not present themselves to readers as unique to these individuals. They're always contextualized by culture. The authenticating details of eking out a living on a bare mountaintop in Yemen, the exotic color of Moroccan weddings and exorcisms, the cloistered opulence of Saudi Arabian palaces, the damp cellars of Pakistani immigrant communities in the north of England, the fields of rural Palestine. The placement in these locations marks the abuses as cultural or collective. Without offering any kind of general picture of the communities in which our heroines live, since these are just personal stories, these memoirs can't give readers any indication that such abuses might be exceptional or might be considered as horrifying in these communities as they would be in ours. Without this contextual information, we're led to attribute these abuses to the whole culture in the selective process that Letty Volpe has called blaming culture for bad behavior. She's a wonderful legal scholar. You should all read if you haven't. So contrary to the messages of uniformity that their copycat covers convey and this cultural framing implies, to someone like me who's familiar with some of the kinds of communities, or the countries at least, in which these books are set, the stories often seem radically specific. When one reads against the grain, there are even plenty of hints that they are unsettling and exceptional stories, even if based on truth. And you can take just an example. There's a trilogy of memoirs beginning with Sold that tells the terrible tale of two girls sold into marriage in Yemen. They're daughters of a British working-class mother and a violent, gambling Yemeni immigrant father. And although the villain is a heartless Arab man, and this was pre-9/11 book, so Muslims weren't yet the obligatory enemy, so it's more specific. The memoirs mention that the families who bought the underage brides were actually from a despised group in Yemen. It's remarked in passing in one of the books that this is a poor country where 3/4 of the men have left home to find work. And you ask yourself, surely this must produce an unusual situation for women, not to mention the minority of men left behind. So this is a peculiar situation. So these stories each use a peculiar situation without marking its radical specificity or perhaps its lack of representativeness, and without giving any context. And the result is that these bestsellers that trade on images of bondage, like Zana's Sold and its sequel about her sister called Not Without Nadia, which is probably a subliminal echo of its popular predecessor, Not Without My Daughter, and then their mother's book called Without Mercy, A Mother's Struggle Against Modern Slavery, they lead readers to surmise that forced marriage is normal in these communities and that women must be rescued from them by outsiders. And the genre is characterized by consistent themes. As I said, coercion and lack of consent, absence of choice, and unfreedom. And to give a flavor of these works and to suggest how the peculiar play with force affects readers, I want to just give you a typical scene. And it's from the sequel to Sold by the mother of the two girls, the two Yemeni girls. And it's, so she's just, boy, am I going to have time for this? I'll try. This is the good part. Anyway, all of these are the good parts. She's just chosen to be sterilized after having 7 kids, and her husband comes home drunk, and she confronts him again about her 2 missing daughters, and he tells her to forget them, and he locks her in the room, and then she recounts, supposedly her words. He was close now, leaning toward me, his beery breath engulfing me. I sat terrified on the sofa. He came closer and held out his hand. I slapped at it furiously, hoping he would go away. Instead, he pulled me up, his good thumb and middle finger around my throat. I fought him off, pushing him to the floor. He grabbed at my dressing gown in a vain effort to save his fall, pulling the material apart, tearing it down its length. "Take your clothes off, all of them," he growled. His eyes traveled over my body, settling on the scar from the operation to sterilize me. He reached out and touched the scarred flesh. I went to slap his hand again when suddenly he grabbed my hand by the wrist and pulled me sharply to the floor, rolling me onto my back and jumping on top of me immediately in a quick movement. I scrunched my eyes shut and clanged my fists to my side. I lay rigid on the floor as he indulged himself, crying out in his pleasure as I cried out in my shame. Now, marital rape epitomizes absence of consent, just as forced marriage does, and this is the practice that's captured the imagination and mobilized the efforts of women's groups and government officials all across Europe. One of its fullest treatments in pulp fiction comes from France, and this is a book called Married by Force by Lila. My name. No last name, though. But it's even more graphic in its violence than Miriam's account. The account of a troubled French girl of Moroccan parentage, the book recounts incidents of violence and terrible cruelty in the family in which Lila grew up. She wants to be like French girls, but they won't let her. Her parents force her to marry a man from Morocco, a husband she hates. She has a frightening encounter with a sex maniac imam hired to exorcise her because she objects to the marriage. And like Zana, Sold's heroine, Layla finally escapes this forced marriage and finds freedom, and it's then that she tells her story. And we're treated to some horrific scenes along the way between husband and wife as she goads her husband into, hating her and wanting to ask for a divorce. I think I'll skip that section because there's something else coming. In another more fanciful book, lightened by a likable heroine who has a weakness for whiskey and extravagant shopping at Bergdorf Goodman, the theme of force is also lashed onto Middle Eastern men. Desert Royal is the 4th in a series of popular books that are presented as the first-person accounts, as told to the author, Jean Sasson, of Sultana, a wealthy feminist Saudi Arabian princess, and it includes incidents that capture the essential, I don't know if I've lost this, unfreedom of women there. And a sexual charge runs through the whole book, but the most sensational scene is a visit Sultana and her 2 teenage daughters pay to a distant cousin. And they've heard rumors that he's built a spectacular palace to replicate paradise, and they want to see it. And their visit is disastrous. Besides finding thousands of caged birds that one daughter madly sets free, the symbolism is really subtle. They come across a pavilion that is signposted stallions. Looking for horses, the other daughter discovers a harem of sex slaves from Asia. The young women are guarded by an exotic, gnomic Sudanese eunuch. As Sultana explains in her apparently even-handed condemnation of patriarchy, quote, "I knew that it was not a simple matter to come between men and their sexual desires. It's the natural inclination of many men, and not only in the Middle East, to seek out young girls or young women as sexual conquests," unquote. Yet, she surmises that their wealthy owner wants these girls for a special cultural reason. In his eyes, she suggests, quote, "These young women were like the seductive virgins called huris that are described in the Quran. I suspected that I was looking at a stage intended to provide untold delights for Fadl, yet this must be the scene of unspeakable hell for these women held against their will." Now, the public appetite for such depictions of sordid and brutal treatment of women by Muslim or Arab men is disquieting. Unlike the many good ethnographies that describe women's everyday lives in these countries, these memoirs of suffering by oppressed Muslim women enjoy a spectacular, enduring popularity. My books don't sell like this, I tell you. They sell millions and they go into many editions. But most disquieting is the constant reference to sex. The focus on sexual abuse has made some of these memoir writers award-winning activists, too, who get many prizes from Glamour magazine and so forth. So the question is, what makes these books so appealing and their authors so celebrated when the writing is often appalling, as you could tell, and the stories are so extreme? And to understand this, I think we have to place them in the context in which they're being read. And these books are caught up in a charged international political field in which Arabs, Muslims, and particular others are seen as dangers to the West. The feminists who write the blurbs on the covers of these far-fetched books are often associated with right-wing and Zionist groups. The personal letter from Sultana that prefaces Desert Royal openly engages international politics by framing the book as an invitation to the West. She says, "I hope you are not weary of hearing our tragic tales, for we are gaining small freedoms here and there, and we continue to need your attention and your support. Without media attention and political intervention from other lands, most of our men would be most joyous to return to a time of utter darkness for the females living in Saudi Arabia," unquote. Now, that books about bad Arabs who force and enslave girls have a special place in the politics of European immigration is revealed by the enthusiastic reception of such books in France. And 3 of the classics of the genre were first published or publicized there: Burned Alive, the memoir by Saad, and Jacqueline Thibault of a Palestinian honor killing survivor; Sold, the book by Zana Mohsen and her ghostwriter Andrew Crofts about the girls in Yemen. Zana actually appeared on primetime French television and published her book in French before English. And then Married by Force by Lila and Marie-Therese Cuny. And French anxieties about North African immigrants are particularly intense, as we all know, as these Arab Muslims form a post-colonial underclass in the restless suburbs or banlieue, and I could say a lot more about that. But in Britain, in the past decade, with troops stationed in Iraq and Afghanistan, eruptions of public hysteria about Sharia arbitration courts and burqas, fears of, or niqabs, or whatever we want to call them, right? Fears of homegrown fanaticism instigated by the 7/11 bombings, and feminist agitation leading to national legislation against honor crimes and forced marriage. There, I think it's Pakistanis, not Arabs, who've emerged as the main authors of these memoirs. And some of the same ghostwriters who wrote the earlier ones with the Arab women are now writing them with the Pakistani women. And the pornographic elements of these memoirs was really surprising to me. I didn't normally read these things. I only did it for my research. But the dynamics are clearest in one published in Britain in 2009 that most directly challenges the authority of Islam at a time, and most of them have like a little thing that, like, not all Muslims are like this. I don't mean they don't want to be sued for libel, but here it is. So this one was at a time when this hysteria about the arbitration courts was at its height, and the villain is a horrid imam, and the heroine, his daughter, in North England. And typical of its graphic scenes of rape and abuse of this little girl by her father, an apparent pillar of the Muslim community, who locks her in the cellar for his work, is the following, and maybe I won't read it all the way through because it's actually, not good. Anyway, she says, "Dad was like a terrifying predator. I never knew when he would strike. Once I was in the bathroom when all of a sudden Dad just barged in. He locked the door." And then there's more. "He took down his shalwar kameez, baggy pants, and plunked himself down on the loo. He forced me to watch as he started touching himself and breathing heavily. I tried to look away in disgust, but he grabbed me by the hair and forced my face towards him," and I won't finish it. But I think here you can see most clearly how these memoirs are meant to inspire horror and pity, followed by admiration for our heroine's survivors' escapes into freedom. And freedom means escaping not just the Muslim men who torment them, but their own communities and cultures. They often describe themselves as having been rebellious teenagers, and I think this is the feminist difference of the late 20th and into 21st century literary productions, where brown women seem to want to be rescued by their white sisters and friends, to adapt, again, Gayatri Spivak's famous formulation about the colonial period. If these Muslim girls and women were not portrayed as wanting what we want, love, choice, sexual freedom, preferring instead to be dutiful daughters living in the bosom of their families, virgins at marriage, devoted wives partnering with their husbands, or pious individuals seeking to live up to the moral ideals of their religion and its laws, it would be very hard for Western readers to identify, and it would be hard for publishers to find such eager audiences if they offered us women and girls who challenged our assumptions about what they should want and what's good for them. Western women wouldn't anymore be the role models, nor would they feel needed. And interestingly, this freedom is not necessarily presented as secular, and I was surprised to find the book about the Pakistani Imam, Shah's, it's called The Imam's Daughter. I found it advertised on a website called Christian Books, where it was described as, quote, "a true story of a courageous woman who broke free of cultural oppression and embraced a new life in Christ. She married who she wanted, an amazing account of God's saving grace," unquote, and she did convert. So the only pious women who appear in this genre of oppressed Muslim women stories are the hapless victims grievously betrayed by their silent God, who appear in the most extreme and controversial examples. And I think you can see the mobilization of this pornography of bondage for anti-immigrant European politics in the film that actually breaks with the faux cultural kind of color of these genres, and that is the famous or infamous film Submission by Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And I hardly need to rehearse the story here in Utrecht, where so many Dutch scholars have analyzed Hirsi Ali very brilliantly. And all I wanted to note is the way the film implies that such abuses that she describes are sanctioned, if not directly caused, by Islam, ignoring centuries of interpretation, exegetical, judicial, and everyday of the Quranic verses in question that she has carved on their backs, or and silent on the abhorrence of rape or incest in the Islamic legal tradition, not to mention all Muslim societies. But what's so amazing about this film is really the pornographic visuals, which actually Anneliese Morse has captured perfectly, I think, by calling it hardcore Orientalism. And that was years ago that you said that. So if we want to appreciate the allure of this genre, I think we have to confront this pornographic aspect And I found some interesting help from Marcus Wood, the scholar who's analyzed what he calls plantation pornography, and to ask what are the effects of a genre of pornography with its objectification of the subjects, with its depiction of violence, sexual force, and bondage, when it's tied to a racial politics and a legacy of colonial and racial domination. And Wood looked at the role of 18th and 19th century British writings and pictures, often placed in the context of abolitionist literature, that depict the abuse of black bodies in the Atlantic slave trade, noting how it overflows into the present in all sorts of ways, but I won't go into that. But he shows how central this pornographic genre was to the misrepresentation of slavery, and he reads John Gabriel Stedman's 1790 classic text, Narrative of a 5 Years Expedition Against the Revolted Negroes of Suriname, to reveal a troubling double effect. The way the author's attitude constantly shifts between a shrill moral outrage and a series of attempts to emotionally bond with the slave victims by attempting to appropriate their pain in order to show his own sensitivity, and he even marries one of them, right? So we find, I think, similar moral outrage in the pulp nonfiction about the Muslim woman or girl, incited and perhaps excited by the violations and violence of sex. But given the women authors, all, you could call them lapsed Muslims, and the intended audience, largely female and probably mostly non-Muslim, we can see a slightly different dynamic of identification and appropriation of pain put into place. And clearly people find these books gripping enough to buy them in the millions, and their identification with Muslim women victims may be a kind of feminist one, which gives it a slightly different dynamic. So they produce a horror that I think is underwriting a confident sense of moral distinction and Western feminist virtue. A common enemy, patriarchy, supposedly affirms the sisterhood among the readers and the writer, but what's shared is that it's a menacing and irredeemable patriarchal man who's acting out his cultural script, who stands as the clear evil against which such sisterly community can bond. And we know that these men are the targeted enemies of our police forces and our armies. So then we have to ask how such identifications erase readers' roles as perpetrators of violence. I think of Ariela's, the right not to be a perpetrator, insofar as they belong to the community that's involved in the very violence against Muslims abroad and at home, justified here, just as those British men who empathized with the slave victims erased their own national and racial culpability. So does this genre help absolve these perpetrators whose empathetic tears assure them of their own morality, even as fantasizing about abuse grips them? Does their imaginative suffering over others give them not just some kind of pleasure, but also the reassurance of utter distinction and separation from those who suffer? Now, how much time do I have? 3 minutes. Oh, well, here, I'm just getting good. It's your fault. I claim the patriarchy. He took my minutes. That's bad. This is really bad. Okay, so let me think what's the most important thing to say. Maybe I'll just... Okay, so I'm taking 1 minute just to think what to do about this. My argument, right, is that popular literary representations define views and structure feelings about Muslim women and their rights. And I have more to say on that, but I also wanted to bring up something else, which maybe an anthropologist would do. And critiques of representations always incite questions about how else we might understand the world. And it doesn't matter so much to me whether these memoirs are truth or fiction. The question has been how they function in the world of power into which they're inserted. But I do think that it's important to offer alternatives, and I do a lot of that in my book. Most of my book is really trying to take women's suffering in parts of the world that are described here and unpack them to show that they're more complicated. But I think you can even find in the genre itself evidence against the stories that they tell. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali's book is, she's actually a good example because she presents herself as the scripted victim heroine of this kind of genre. But if you read Infidel, her autobiography, there's so much more in there about the complexity of Muslim groups, about her own personal experience, which doesn't at all fit this model. And she even tells this incredible story. So she was supposed to have been forced into marriage. That's why she supposedly got asylum in the Netherlands, anyway, and she describes this incident where she's discovered in the Netherlands, and her husband comes to say, "Why aren't you coming to Canada to be with me?" And she says, "I don't want to go." He brings together, through her father, a group of elders of the clan, and they meet and discuss, and they give her lectures about civil war and honor and family and all of that, and then they say, "Okay, now we want your decision, and we'll come back tomorrow." And she says, "No, I'm ready to give it." And she says, "No." And they say, "Well, why?" And so she argues with them, and then she says, and then she quotes from the Quran, a key concept from the Quran. She says, "It's the will of the soul, it is the will of the soul cannot be coerced." And then she reports, the prince responded, quote, "I respect this answer. I believe all of us should respect it," unquote. And with that, her husband agrees to the divorce. All the men stood up, she reports, and one after another, each man cupped my hands in their two hands and left. They were full of respect. Now, this is a kind of surprising procedure and resolution for a community that she would have us believe, in her other works, is under the sway of an incorrigible religion that abuses and denigrates women. So there are these kind of two visions at war in here, one the script and the other out of the complexity of her experience. And I would tell you another story from the Yemenis. There's plenty of evidence even within that of a complex world and decisions and choices people have to make because they love their children or they want to be part of a community that they've become, and they don't want just abstract freedom to be freed by mothers to go back to Britain. But I won't go into that, but I will say that that's one direction I think we have to go to consider the all too human dilemmas that all of us face about choices, about how to live our lives, about how to, what it means to consent. And actually, I end with something from Judith Butler, so maybe you'll give me those minutes to do that, because I think in a really profound essay that she wrote on sexual consent in Law and Psychoanalysis, I think she goes beyond the usual critiques of legal consent to note that consent might not simply be a core liberal value, but part of a strong fantasy of autonomy, and hence our attachment to it. And in the final paragraph of her essay, she really describes what all of us go through. She says, "We are finally creatures of life, including creatures of passion, who need what we cannot fully understand or choose, and whose sexual and emotional lives are marked from the start by this being bound up with one another, with unknowing and necessity." And I think these words give us a different way to begin to think about the divisive grammar that rights talk and pornographic pulp nonfiction enforce. And I'm interested in the kinds of universals that don't divide us artificially into those who freely choose and those who don't, those who enjoy freedom and autonomy and those who don't. And this is a common sense, I think, for all of us, if we just stop to think. But I think this common sense, if we just stop to think, alerts us to the dangerous political role that pulp nonfiction plays in our world as it underwrites kind of moral certainties and a passion for going to war for global women's rights elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I was wondering if the universalism that underlies this tendency that you described, right, the success of these pornographic narratives, is the same one that supported, slavery, colonialism, and it's the classic superiority, sense of superiority of the West, or there is something else. If you see any relationship, or what kind of relationship or dynamic do you see between the institutionalization of human rights in academia and the success of this kind of literature? Thank you.
Connection?
Lila, thank you for an excellent paper. I really enjoyed it. My question is really that while this genre of writing, which I don't know at all, while this takes on the taboos of, say, incest or marital rape, it seems to sort of leave intact the greatest taboo of all, that is, woman as desiring subject. Because, in most cases, as you detailed, it is about women suffering most horrendous kinds of abuse, metaphorical, real, etc. And I wondered if you had a few examples where the pornography actually related to women grabbing and taking the pleasure they want. And the second thing, for me, related to the first question, is really that if if the pornographic gaze is describing things that are so incredibly unbearable to read or see, whether pornography is the right word, and whether, the pleasure associated with this is kind of masochism more than, the other kinds of pleasure we associate with pornography.
Okay, thanks. Hey, we can talk about it later.
Thank you so much. No, I thought we won't speak about the Palestinian story, but it reminds me the same question we asked: what's happened when freedom fighters try to do self-criticism, and when it go to the West, it reminds me, I worked very close with JKLF, Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, and one of the discussion within was one Fasia, one of the people that was involved, was how she deal with the fact that all the women that has been raped by the Indian we become hero in her community and not have to be expelled from her community and commit suicide. And the question I had as a filmmaker also, that when I take these stories to the West, suddenly when it's not the internal discourse of the community, what's happened in this moment when suddenly the West hear the story of the rape, the story that they expel her. So this movement that the discussion from within going outside, and that's more of the question I had of our discussion before between outside and inside and what's happened in the globalization time, that you cannot put boundaries for those discussions.
Yeah. I'm not good at answering questions, but you can try. I like hearing them because they're, that's the interesting part. They're only the occasion for people to actually say something interesting.
I'll be very brief. I think we that are reading post-colonial texts and thinkers, we are, in a way, used to try to think critically about universalism, world as it appears to us, and so on. And I think lots of problems have been showed in the last years through this literature. How many problems we have to face justice in universal discourse and so on. But I think we are in a point, in a very difficult point, which is if binarisms and all those Western constructions, Enlightenment constructions, have to be deconstructed, what are we going to put in its place? I mean, we have, most of us, or lots of us, are trying to think of an alternative epistemic world, mental world. Are we advancing in this construction? the critics we know, but how could we go further? How could we really go deep in this alternative episteme?
Thank you. All right, these are really excellent, which I probably won't remember, between jet lag and all of that. I wasn't saying, to just go quickly from the first one, I wasn't saying that the universalism was in the pornography, but in the human rights discourse. But what's the relationship? I don't know if I can do that one, but were you asking what's the relationship between the interest in human rights in the academy and its hegemony in the world? What's that relationship? I'm not sure that's what it was about, but I think at both levels there's always a connection. That's what we know, is that we just reflect, we try to advance what is out there, but we also embody it ourselves. And maybe it ties to the last question too, of sort of where do we go from here? I'm not a very good person to propose answers. I think we need to be critical all the time, and that's where I am. But when I try to offer the alternatives in my book of particular lives that don't fit these stories that human rights and the literary trafficking reinforce in the kind of division that, we have really complicated lives, and we know that, sometimes we make bad choices in relationships, and we have to choose between, I say, like, at both ends, like, I've got to care for my aging mother, as many of you do, and I'm not free. Is that bondage? Is that, that's what we all live with, right? We are tied to each other in all kinds of complicated ways, and I don't think that that's untrue anywhere. That's a kind of universalism. I think the part I skipped in here was actually bringing you back to Edward Said, and he's sometimes criticized for his humanism, but I think that's where it lies, that there's some way in which one has to imagine that there's another way to relate to each other than as the free, autonomous, liberated, Western feminist, human rights-bearing subject and the oppressed Muslim woman who needs to be saved. We're all in this world dealing with many similar things, and I try to go that direction in my work, although this particular one was really critique. But I think critique is very important, to just vigilance about the ways these things are working, because of course, you can't be against human rights, right? Didn't you say that, or somebody, right? Many people say that, right? We can't say I'm against human rights, but what does it mean to use that language? What are its entailments of universality? What kind of universality? Who's the one, who does it apply to? Who gets to bring it to people? All of that we need to think about, and what institutions have been created in and around it. That's what I would like to ask. So that's probably those two. Taboos, that's very interesting. I think I presented this once before, and people also objected to my use of pornography as the word for it. And I think, I didn't want to get into all the debates about pornography, and maybe that's not the right word to use. I don't know quite, I don't know what to call it when it's about sex and bondage. There may be another word for it. But what isn't in any of these is women as desiring subjects, except maybe Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is, not writing these kinds of memoirs, and it's after her emancipation that she can do that, and her emancipation is in order to, but they don't figure in the ones that I've read. In terms of desire, there's freedom from this kind of abuse, but there's never any positive relations that are depicted, although I would, I haven't read them all. So there may be something that I missed, but that's just not part of it. So maybe it's the wrong thing, but there is something about, I was surprised at, these kind of graphic descriptions of things, and you sort of think there must be some pleasure for the readers in that. I don't know what it is, but I think it's about that you can be horrified, you can think you're not that person. I think part of it is there must be some of the pleasure in being, I'm not the person on the floor. I'm not the person this is happening to, so there's some kind of way that it makes you feel better, but I don't actually understand like pleasure in reading very well. It's not my field. But there's something in there that surprised me. Again, I mean, you have all you literary people, you can help me out with it, but it is, it's very strange, very badly written, but they sell so well. You look at how many editions there are. Every year they're reprinted, from 1991, one of these books. And I think, boy, we would be happy if any of our books were reprinted every year since 1991. So what is this? And they're badly written, there's a lot. So, and they keep coming out. And then they shift in terms of the popularity of the population, so there was that British moment when it becomes Pakistani women. You just have to look at this and say, this is organized in a certain way, it's helping produce something, it feeds something that's there. And I think most of the feminists and the people who work in organizations against honor crimes and so forth would not want to see themselves as somehow related to this genre, and yet you can see the connection. So freedom fighter, I don't know what to do with that, but I think the most important point in there that we had actually been talking about earlier is that one can have these books are not written for internal audiences anyway. I mean, they're always ghostwritten and written by journalists, and Mukhtar Mai in Pakistan, the same person who did one of these Arab ones goes to Pakistan and writes her memoir, so she doesn't speak either language. So there's something, it's not for inside, it's not internal criticism, it is for a public that's actually sometimes is taken internally, and there are voices inside that might support the kinds of things, the missions, but I don't think they're meant for internal. But at this point, and the dilemma that I think we were talking about earlier was that there is no way to separate an internal discussion about an issue in a community from its mobilization and appropriation in circuits that extend beyond it and that have different politics to them and different causes attached to them, so that's where we're sort of stuck, and that's where I always find myself stuck criticizing, I'm not against human rights, I'm not against feminism, I'm a feminist, but why am I standing like this saying there's something wrong here? It's because I'm standing in the world of thinking colonial, post-colonial, Middle East invasions, what kind of imperial world are we in, and what complicity does feminism have in that, or how is feminism getting mobilized for things that we would not necessarily want in other parts of our politics. So that's what I've been struggling with for years, and it's a very difficult thing to do, and I don't think I ever do it quite perfectly, or maybe not at all, but that's where I struggle, and part of me comes back to a different kind of humanism as some kind of answer, just in order to not divide. Yeah, we all have problems. Let's deal with all those problems, not let's take up certain political issues that end up dividing people along lines that they're already being divided politically. So that's it. Thanks.